Welcome everyone to TRT for World Forum Digital Debates for our session tonight, Decoding Lebanon's Elections, the Road Ahead. Unfortunately, Dr. Yahya won't be joining us today. She's feeling unwell and is unable to join, but we're joined by two excellent guests, Heiko Vimin, the director for Crisis Group for Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and Luna Safwan, independent journalist and opinion writer, who both of them are joining us from Beirut tonight. So, of course, Lebanon continues to be in the throes of one of the worst economic crises of the past 150 years. The value of the lira is now worth less than 10% of its 2019 value. And of course, in a country that imports almost everything, this has meant an increase in the cost of basic goods upwards of 650%. This has translated into the middle class being effectively wiped out, with 80% of Lebanese now living in poverty. Basic public services, which had already been lacking for some time, are now effectively non-existent. Many within Lebanon, as well as internationally, hold Lebanon's ruling class collectively responsible for the situation. The parliamentary elections, which were held on May 15th, were seen by many as an opportunity for Lebanon to vote for change. And while candidates broadly connected to the 2019 protest movement performed well, traditional parties largely held on to their positions. So the question, of course, is political change coming to Lebanon? Independent and reformist candidates did make gains, while some traditional parties lost ground. However, it remains to be seen what impact, if any, the newcomers might have as Lebanon continues to grapple with an unprecedented economic crisis. And again, there's lots of things to unpack here. So again, thank you for joining us this evening to try to unpack some of these complex dynamics at play here. So I guess I'll start with you, Heiko. So if we're looking at the results of the May 15th elections, how much of a shift does this actually represent in Lebanese politics? Are you able to sort of paint a picture to kind of explain where there were shifts, where there wasn't, and what it means in general?
Well, I think it is a significant shift, and what we've seen, we see that now we have about 10% of the MPs in Parliament, of the new MPs, represent a different model of politics. Represent a model of politics that is rooted in a new generation, first of all, that has gone beyond the post-war generation. It's a new generation that operates politics on issues rather than on identity politics, that operates outside the clientelist system. And that, I think, is a significant change, and I would say is a change that was long overdue, and that would have happened almost inevitably in any other system. But because the electoral system is so much biased against newcomers, new players, it took all this time and it took all this crisis to actually get to this point. And now we have these 12, 13 people who are now in there, and I think they will change discussions in Parliament. They will change how politics are made or how policies are designed. They will enter some of the parliamentary committees, like one of the new candidates is now on the financial committee, these are all small steps, these are small inroads, but they're going to be, I'm pretty certain they're going to change the way politics are made and policies are designed. But it happens in the context of state collapse. So the question is really how much politics and how much policies that actually matter, that can actually shape things, can still be done under these conditions.
Luna, I'll pass the same question to you essentially. So from your angle, Heiko outlined how the entrance of these dozen or so independent MPs does represent a large shift. From your view, what kind of shifts are we looking at in the politics in Lebanon, and what does this kind of mean moving forward?
Well, first things first, I'm happy that we had the elections in Lebanon, because there was a moment when everyone was discussing the possibility of the elections not happening at all, which would have been a crisis of its own, given how much time people have spent waiting for these elections, expecting these elections to happen, lobbying or trying to lobby for these elections to happen. So the mere fact that these elections happened is one big and important step. Certainly, the Lebanese in Lebanon, the way we saw the numbers, what we observed, certainly they could have voted more. The numbers did not really exceed the expectations by high percentages. We do have this discussion. We always were repeating that we needed more numbers. We wish that some people went and voted, but you understand where they come from. And this despair and this sense of we cannot do anything to change the country sadly took over the majority. The majority of people who were not encouraged, but still we had some wins, some important wins. The way I see it, also the diaspora played an important role in lobbying and in pushing for these elections. The numbers from the Lebanese diaspora were really, really high and impressive, and the efforts were really motivating. Maybe this is the kind of support that both communities, those who are stuck in Lebanon and those who had the way to actually leave at a certain point, maybe this is where they collided. But there's a bigger challenge ahead, in my opinion, and it's how much can these newly elected MPs push in the parliament. I am sure that they're going to cause some headache for traditional political parties. They surely did cause some headache for the Speaker of the Parliament on the first session. So it was a really nice dynamic to see. New faces. You might not agree with everything that they represent. Yes, some of them are having maybe backdoor talks with some traditional parties whom they think might be alike in terms of some maybe goals or some solutions that they look at. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, there are now more people to rise against the traditional political parties and specifically the big powers involved in the big decision-making process, politically, but also economically in the country. So I would say I am cautiously optimistic, but I am very happy that these elections happened. Being someone who had to leave Lebanon at a certain point, I did not expect that it would happen this smoothly, and yet it did. But it reflected what we lack most, which is accountability. We did witness a lot of wrongdoings during the elections, and these remained unaddressed basically by the government. So in brief, this is how I see it happening right now.
So both of you, I think, touched on an important point there. This idea that there's, at the very least, a new dynamic that's been injected into the politics in the country, which is very important and represents, in many ways, a big leap forward. Heiko, I'm going to turn to you here. So, Luna, you touched on this point of sort of voter participation and voter turnout. And Heiko, as well, you had mentioned that the electoral system itself is sort of it's designed to make it difficult for newcomers to come in. So voter turnout, I think, as Luna was alluding to, has been an issue for some time in Lebanon. The most recent elections were lower than the previous ones. I believe they were just over 40% or so was the voter turnout. To many from the outside, this may seem as a bit of an oddity, given sort of Lebanon's somewhat unique position in the region of sort of having, I don't want to say functional democratic institutions, but having a tradition of sort of democratic practices that has been ongoing since independence. However, of course, we have this issue of voter apathy, of people feeling hopeless that they can't change the system. So, Heiko, in your view, I'm wondering if you can go into some of the core reasons behind the sort of high level of political apathy in the country. What do these sort of Okay, so we had low participation selection, but we had these independent candidates get into the parliament. So, looking at these two different dynamics in play, dropping voter turnout, but a rise in sort of independent candidates actually succeeding and passing the electoral threshold. What does it indicate about the future politics of the country, and how might there actually be steps taken to go about reversing the level of political participation in the society?
Okay, so let me challenge the premise a little bit here, So, I mean, okay, so I'm not sure about the percentage. 42% was the number that we heard, I think, on election day or the next day. Later, it was reassessed, and then a number of 49% came up, basically saying there were some calculation errors, whatever. I'm not sure. I'm not certain about this 100%, but you also have to keep in mind that 40 whatever percent in Lebanon, be it 42 or 50%, is different from 40 or 50% in Germany or France or whatever. There's a huge amount of people who are on the electoral rolls who are not in Lebanon, right? There's a number of people on the electoral rolls who are actually dead. That's a fact. So these rolls are not accurate, and if dead people obviously can't vote unless there's manipulation. Somebody votes for them, and people in the diaspora now had the chance to vote, but that's still something that requires effort. It's not entirely straightforward, the whole thing. And I mean, many of the people in the diaspora may not identify with the political process or may not be invested in the political process enough to actually participate. And they will not also not go and have their names removed from the rolls. So I think 50% in Lebanon is actually, if it was really 50%, is probably more like 70% in a developed, let's say, consolidated democracy like France, for instance. So that's one. I think I don't think there's apathy. As far as I know the figures, 250,000 people voted for these change candidates in terms of preferential votes. That's a huge amount of people. Also, for instance, 350,000 people voted for a party like Hezbollah. Now, we can have an opinion on them, we can dislike them, we can ask questions about the way they mobilize, all fair, but I don't think you can call that political apathy. So, I mean, there are constituencies, or there are political forces that can mobilize their constituencies quite efficiently, one way or the other. That's one. Now, another thing is that, I mean, and there I come back to the electoral system. A huge obstacle is that the proportional system, that so-called proportional system that now exists, in some places is proportional only in name. And I spoke to people who are, let's say, from an area in the northern Bihar, who basically tell me, everybody should vote. I love to vote, but I know how the numbers are in where I come from, and I know that the people that I would want to vote into parliament have absolutely zero chances of succeeding, because in some areas the voter threshold is just too high. You have, I mean, in some areas it's 7%. That is probably acceptable. In other areas, it's 20%. Or maybe even 22%. So if the candidate you vote for, the list you vote for, does not reach these 22%, which is an incredibly high threshold for newcomers who have no political, have no money, no funding, no apparatus, no political machine, then you will have a lot of people deterred from voting who would otherwise really want to vote. And they say, why should I do that? So I don't think wouldn't talk about apathy necessarily. And finally, there is, I guess, also a certain amount of voters who are very much disenchanted with the existing political parties, who would like to reorient themselves, who would like to vote somebody else, but who do not yet put enough faith into new forces. And that is very typical in these situations, and that's very understandable. When these people are not tested, these people have no political track record. They may have a track record of being professionals, that are having high competence, but they have no political track record. So then the question: can these people really are very good in whatever environment or other areas? Can these people actually do something in a dirty business like politics? I mean, I think that's a very legitimate question, and people having doubt. I mean, we should understand that people have doubts on that, and I think if we looking forward, if these people have now been voted in, perform well, maybe some of this, part of this constituency can be swayed from now until the next polls.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point to raise. Actually, this idea that, many of these new faces are untested politically, and one that's not often brought up often in kind of these discussions. So I appreciate that point. Luna, if we're looking at, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of how the elections played out in Hezbollah strongholds in the south, in particular. Of course, one of the big headlines of coming out of the elections has been that the Hezbollah-led parliamentary majority is no longer, which is reflective of many important dynamics in the country, to be sure. However, the so-called Shia duopoly of Amal and Hezbollah did manage to hold their respective grounds in their strongholds. However, of course, in the lead up to the elections, we saw a number of intimidation campaigns against their opponents. And for many, this indicates that perhaps there's a sense among these political movements that maybe not all is well in their constituency. I'm wondering if you can give sort of some insight into the extent of the opposition to Hezbollah within the Shia community and within, I guess, South Lebanon in particular. At places such as Baalbek, Harmel, these places which are traditional strongholds, which, of course, during the 2019 uprising, we saw pretty consistent protests in these places, amongst other things. So we can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So we have to start by mentioning that there wasn't any political candidate for the parliament from the Shiite sect who actually won in these elections. Many had their names, proposed. They wanted to pursue the elections. They wanted to move forward with that, but we had a lot of dropout. So some of them were running with some traditional political parties like the Lebanese forces. Some of them were trying to run independently, but it did not build up enough, because you have two factors here. One is, and let's be very frank about that, there are so many threats. We have experiences with either activists, political activists, journalists, or even simply people who are just opposing Hezbollah in a certain context, and not opposing Hezbollah in a very thorough and angry and violent way. They're just opposing what is happening in the politics, and yet they get threatened, they are intimidated, and they are pressured by their families. So this happened before these elections. We had a lot of dropouts. There were not enough candidates. No one even won. And then you have the second factor, away from the elections and the candidates, you have the people who are electing. So there is a factor of fear, in my personal opinion, that is always brought to light when we are talking about the community in Lebanon, the majority of the community, not all the Shiite community, of course, but there's always this kind of fear factor. We have an enemy. Israel is just around the border, but also we have enemies inside the country who are different political parties who want to bring us down, who want to take the majority out of this sect, away from politics, away from the country. So this kind of combination between the politics and the religion is what is making it harder for people, in my opinion, to step away from this umbrella that is represented by these two duo, the Shiite duo, Amal and Hezbollah, who promise, most of the time, they promise stability, they promise prosperity, they promise safety for the lands that the people live in South Lebanon and the Bekaa. They promise the safety of the borders, but this hasn't been 100% applicable, because when the economic crisis started, despite the problems that everyone had with the banks, we had a problem on the borders in Lebanon when it comes to everything related to power, when it comes to everything related to the material, basically, to the oil and gas sector. There's been a lot of smuggling in these areas, specifically in the Bekaa Valley. People and locals there were complaining. They were also lacking power. They were also lacking energy. They were also left helpless at certain times, standing in long lines in front of gas stations, as everyone else is, even though right in front of their eyes, there were these trucks going from Lebanon to Syria to smuggle the goods. But weirdly enough, this still did not create a sense of wanting to change something. Maybe because the people who are to replace Hezbollah and Amal were not convincing enough for the community, or maybe because the community sees it as we're going from one extreme to another. So we're going from the extreme that we're in, which is Amal and Hezbollah and Iran and supporting, the Iranian regime and all of this sector, and we're going into the field of the EU, the US, the international entities, being funded by international entities, which is also something that usually is used to accuse anyone who's opposing that community of working against the community because they are aligning with the US, with the EU. So maybe this alternative does not represent them, and hence there were no candidates. There were no real independent candidates who made it. Some tried, some were intimidated, and some took the decision after the pressure by families, by the society to back off. And I think there's still a long way for the community to go. In my opinion, the only motive for this to recreate a balance is really the economic crisis that is happening. Because I think all Lebanese at a certain point are feeling that we are on the same level, we are struggling, we are having the same struggles, even if a certain party gives us some goods because we support them, for a few days, it's still not enough. This is not a continuous and stable life. But other than that, you feel like, lastly, this is the thing I want to say, that you fear whenever the duo is very close to actually maybe having a bigger loss, let's say, in its supportive community. Again, the discussion about the borders, about Israel, about a possible war, about the threats rises. And now it's rising not because they are the ones who pushed it to the front, but because we are talking about the maritime borders and the oil and gas sector in Lebanon. So automatically it's rising again. But they certainly make use of this conversation to empower how, in their opinion, how essential they are to the community. And the community is convinced. Unless you find a way to convince them otherwise, they're going to keep voting for the duo. And to be realistic here.
Yeah, I think that touches on an important point as well, which is maybe lost to outside observers, is this idea of not just Hezbollah and Amal, but some of the other traditional parties of presenting themselves as being the only way forward for their respective communities, or they're the only ones standing in between Lebanon and another civil war. So they use these discourses a lot, which I think is an important point to bring out. Heiko, on this note of Hezbollah and Amal, if we're looking at, let's say, outside of the core constituency in the Shia community, in the Druze, Sunni, and Christian communities, a number of longtime pro-Hezbollah and pro-Syrian regime figures actually lost out to reformist candidates in this election, with Sunni allies of Hezbollah faring particularly badly. Luna talked about the situation within the core constituency. What did this election say about both the so-called resistance bloc political future outside of its core constituency in Lebanon?
If you allow me, just a little rejoinder on what Luna said and the previous conversation. So I think it's relevant and interesting to differentiate within the Shia political spectrum between Amal and Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has, in these elections, successfully managed to mobilize their supporters. I think they even gained votes compared to the last elections. Amal has not. So, and I think and that has been a long-standing trend that you see Amal, the Amal movement, over the past years consistently losing ground in the community, not necessarily to Hezbollah, but their capacity to mobilize, to get people to the polls has been decreasing. Thanks to the alliance with Hezbollah, thanks to the electoral system, this has not translated in losses of seats. but the loss of popular support is very clear, and there are huge problems in the movement. I mean, to begin with, there's no clear successor for Nabi Berri. It's really nobody knows what's going to happen with this party or movement. The moment Berri is incapacitated in one way or another. The man is 84, so I mean, this is not something that is necessarily far off. So that's one thing. Second thing, I think you should also recognize that before the elections, there was a lot of identity politics was being played, and identity politics was being played from Hezbollah's opponents. Now, that may have served these opponents well in their own communities and in their own competition among, let's say, in the Christian community. Yani, who is the most belligerent, who is the most valiant against speaking out against Iranian occupation, against Hezbollah as a cult of death, and all of this kind of rhetoric probably serves them well in their own communities, but it also serves Hezbollah because it makes it very easy for the party to basically present itself and the community as this beleaguered fortress of virtue, of nationalist virtue, that's being attacked by all these collaborators with Israel and America. I mean, it's a discourse that is very transparent to people like us. But I think in the community it works. It still works, and it still has traction. So I think we should look at it that way, or we need to think about it that way as well. Now, concerning the allies, I think the interesting thing that happened is that the newcomers, the new competitors, were able to make inroads specifically in those areas among those allies of Hezbollah. So if you look at where people, if you look at the south, 2 MPs in South 3, and like an area where traditionally we would expect that the Shia duo would reign supreme. And I think one of the candidates was very outspoken in his anti-Hezbollah positions. Now, he's not a Shiite, but this could still bring enough votes in this area to actually win a seat. And in a place like Tripoli, somebody like Faisal Karami was defeated in elections quite narrowly, but he still was defeated, and the change candidate was voted in. And you have that observation in many places. So you can see that this core, if you want, this core resistance camp, the 8 March coalition camp, it has a hard core, but the shell around it is far less resilient, is far less susceptible to new challenges. And I think it works on the other side too. So I mean, and if you look at the allies of the FPM, of the Free Patriotic Movement, or the independents, or the voter pool, this Christian voter pool that is not hardcore anti-Hezbollah, that are not convinced followers of the Lebanese forces, but that is somewhere more in the middle. They are also susceptible to these new forces. So there is the center, I think, is moving. The polls are perhaps even hardening. I mean, you see that Hezbollah has gained ground within their camp. The Lebanese forces have gained ground within their camp. So the polls are hardening, but the center is moving, and that is a very interesting configuration. It can make things very difficult going forward in terms of finding majorities or finding enough people to cooperate on issues, on policy issues, because the extremes may actually try to pull the center on their respective sides and create an even deeper divide in society and in politics.
Luna, I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit too, in terms of the sort of political dynamic that Heiko was mentioning, in terms of the, I guess, sort of the support for this bloc, as well as the hardcore of the other bloc outside of their core constituencies, let's say.
Well, of course, I mean, given that the structure of Lebanon is sadly sectarian when it comes to the elections, when it comes to the division of our three main chairs, if you want to say, who handles the presidency, who handles the parliament, and who handles the cabinet. It's just sectarian by choice within how Lebanon was formed. So in Lebanon, we kind of learned to look at politics from within sects. Like this sect did not have any opposition members, that sect did not have any opposition members, when in fact, it shouldn't really be only related to one sect. Hence, the majority that Heiko was talking about, it's very important here because they face two main challenges. I think that Amal, Hezbollah, and all of the traditional political parties, minus some of them who also try to align themselves with the new parties, they are facing the challenge of maybe, and I'm just saying maybe, having a stronger coalition inside the parliament, a coalition that can oppose them. But this is a double-edged sword, because at a certain point, sure, you can push traditional parties, especially as Heiko was saying, for example, Amal movement, who really did not gain a lot of chairs inside the parliament. You could be pushing them into a corner, but also you could fail at forming this coalition, and then they could end up pushing you to a corner because you're new and you're weak, and you just don't want to maybe step it down a notch or tone it down a notch and just try to create new coalitions, because we have seen this opposition moved from the streets to the parliamentary elections. And in between, a lot of people had doubts. One of these doubts were the ability of these different coalitions to stand up against traditional political parties. So, of course, I do see that it's shaking when it comes to political parties. Traditionally, their ground is a bit shaky, if I may describe it this way, because they do have entities who want to oppose them strongly. But at the same time, if these entities are not strong enough to work together as an opposition, if they cannot come to an agreement on whether or not they want to work with some of the traditional parties or not, because you have traditional parties like, for example, Kata'ib. There's a big debate happening all the time on whether or not the newly elected MPs are to work with this party or not. And Kata'ib tried really hard to rebrand themselves and represent themselves as a post-Thawra or post-revolution political party, but they did not succeed in a lot of ways. So you have the opposition and the new parliamentary members and some traditional parties who are originally in opposition, let's say from the remains of March 14th, you do have them agreeing at a certain point that they do oppose the same problems. However, those who remained from March 14th participated in previous governments, participated in previous cabinets, elected the president, did not really discuss what went wrong politically. Some of them were even participating in the parliament and the cabinet when the explosion happened in Beirut. So many question marks here. Two main points that, in my opinion, would play a big role in opposing traditional parties in the parliament, which is one, being able to form a strong coalition, but also two, deciding who are you going to work with from the traditional parties. Are we going to have this conversation forever, whether or not the LF and Kata'ib and other parties whom we might share some very few agreements with can join when we want to vote and oppose the majority of the parliament in something, or we just need to cut the cord here and not be in a coalition with these parties at all. And this is where I really agree with Heiko about these names being new. We don't know them in politics. We're just starting to see how they work, how they function, how loud they can be, and what their reactions might be.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, and I think we started to touch a little bit on, let's say, the other side of the coin, and I want to talk about that a little bit and sort of bringing in some of the, I guess, regional players or regional dynamics into these elections itself. In the lead, and so Heiko, I'll put this out to you, and Luna, feel free to jump in if you'd like as well. In the lead up to the polls, a number of observers pointed to this sort of intensive Saudi re-engagement in the country. That Walid Bukhari, the Saudi ambassador, was traveling around the country, visiting different constituencies, of Saudi Arabia's traditional allies. The strongest of which at the moment is obviously the Lebanese forces. However, amidst what was effectively, although not officially, but effectively a boycott of the polls by Saad Hariri supporters, the dissolution of the Future movement. To what extent, I guess, can we say in this context that these Saudi activities were significant in the election? Was this sort of a case of too little, too late from their perspective? And I guess on the flip side as well, if we're looking at the other side of the coin, do we see the same type of direct, Iranian sort of engagement with their respective communities, or is that a relationship that's more solid, and so they don't really have to engage in the same way that the Saudis might feel that they have to?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to describe the Saudi position towards and in Lebanon as not exactly consistent, right? I mean, you could actually also say erratic, I mean, and of course the Iranian position is exactly the opposite. I mean, the Iranians are playing the long game. They have been playing the long game forever. I mean, since for the past 30 years, and they have built up their local allies in a way that allows them to remain far from everyday politics, and that does not require any kind of activity or like visible presence as the Saudis have done. So I mean, if you destroy your ally, your Lebanese ally, your main partner, let's say, I don't want to say client in Lebanon, but your main partner, if you disown him and destroy him politically, and then you don't build up somebody else in his place, then you pull out and you adopt a policy of an empty chair for a couple of months, to I don't know, as a measure of punishment, whatever the exact motivation was, and then you return. I mean, it's obviously not that way. You cannot play the long game, and that way you have to do it really very visible, and you have to be present yourself, like Walid Bukhari was. All the iftars he gave, and I mean, the results, of course, I think from the Saudi perspective are probably underwhelming. I mean, I've heard, I was told in the run-up to the elections by various Sunni politicians in particular, not only Sunni actually, by several politicians from this camp, that there was a real, that supposedly that they were fearing a real danger that Hezbollah and their allies may actually sweep the polls to an extent that they could reach a two-third majority. Of course, once you have a two-third majority in Lebanon, you could potentially, at least formally, do anything you like. You can impose a president, you can form any government you like, you are in total control. And they're creating this kind of threat scenario. To be honest, I did not really believe any of this. I'm not sure they were believing it. But perhaps the Saudis believed it. Perhaps the Saudis were convinced that this threat was real. Or they decided either way that it was better to rejoin the fray and limit damage. So that, I think that is that. I mean, I cannot obviously not read the minds of the people in Riyadh or here in Beirut, but it seems that was a plausible motivation. There may have been some commitments to Emmanuel Macron and France. I mean, there seems to be communication, a lot of communication between the French and the Saudis on this matter, and the French definitely have impressed on Saudi Arabia that the policy of boycotting Lebanon is not exactly helpful. So all of that, I guess, prompted them to come back with limited results. I mean, but the real question now is, to me, and I don't have an answer to that so far at least, is what are they here for? Are they here just for damage control? Are they just here to create some kind of line of defense against Hezbollah? Are they here to play ball? Are they here to pursue their interests? Are they here to suppose a political project? Which, if they are, then I think that is not necessarily a bad thing, because at the end of the day, I mean, you have one of the pillars of Lebanon. We talk about the sectarian order, as Luna rightly said, like, as much as we are wishing it away, I mean, you cannot really escape this reality. So if you have one of the major communities, one of the pillars of the sectarian system, that is the Sunni community, in such a disarray as it is now, politically fragmented, without effective leadership, you really have a problem. It's really in an already difficult situation. You're making an already difficult situation where it's really, really difficult and complicated, and perhaps not possible to actually find and create a cohesive leadership that is needed to get out of this crisis. If one of those communities is in such disarray, it's really much more difficult. So if the Saudis are back for that, the Saudis are back to actually help reactivate this community, help to form the anti-Hezbollah elements into some sort of workable political camp that can then negotiate effectively and try to find a compromise. I think that would be positive. That would be a positive development. It's probably required to move forward, and we'll see, and we'll have to see if that's really what they want.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I want to move briefly here, just in the time we have left, to sort of looking forward a little bit. So we'll start with kind of, I guess, a wrap-up question of the elections themselves, and then we'll have a brief discussion on sort of what the road ahead is. So, Luna, if we're looking at these election results as a totality here, and all of the different dynamics that we've discussed so far, if we're looking at the sort of, I guess, opposition and change party, some call them reformist candidates, historically, and at least in recent history in Lebanon, there's been a sense amongst many people that at least those coming from more of a civil society background are, I guess, say, detached in some ways kind of from the everyday concerns or the everyday outlooks of many of the people in the country. However, as we've seen in these elections, and Heiko pointed out, preferential votes, they gain, over 250,000 for these change candidates. So clearly, despite all the unknowns and questions that remain, there is some move towards these candidates. If we're looking at kind of the overall picture here, what would you, in your mind, are both the challenges and opportunities facing these sort of change and reformist candidates, new faces that are coming into the parliament, and sort of moving forward in the political process in Lebanon?
Well, I think everyone had the chance to run for these elections, which was great, because we kind of witnessed the unveiling of the post-2019 protests politically. How the majority of what we've witnessed in the street, so many faces that we are familiar with, some of them who were even protesting at a certain moment, like Firas Hamdan, the new MP, who was shot in the eye and injured in the eye. He went back into the parliament as an elected member of the parliament. So we did witness, and Firas did not come from this background that is disconnected from the rest of the society at all, even though he is an active part of the civil society. So the role and the shape and the identity of the civil society in Lebanon really went through different phases since, let's say, 2015. But the real change was in 2019, in my opinion, when so many of these entities, civil society members, protesters, people coming from different backgrounds, met together and actually looked at each other and found a common ground for the first time in years. And this persisted even though the protests ended at a certain moment. So I think the challenge is how to make this effective in the parliament, but also how to make sure that there's still a civil society outside of the parliament, because we should also hold those who now represent us accountable in the parliament if they don't perform as expected when it comes to responsibility, when it comes to the priorities. And the priorities right now, as much as I would like to talk about politics, but the priorities are economic. There's a real economic crash happening in the country. It is getting worse day by day. There's nothing more horrible than reading articles about cancer patients not being able to find medicine or being ready to die. I read a headline today that says that there's a 22-year-old cancer patient who is ready for death. She basically made her peace with the idea that she might not find her medicine and eventually die. So, as much as I think politics are important regionally and locally, there's a real economic crisis. Without it, no one will be able to strive and to even try to change in the country. There will be no more energy. Doctors are leaving, people are leaving, activists. I left, a lot of people like me left. So, there are still some who are willing to fight, but they need the economy to be able to fight this fight because it's not easy. They don't come from, they're not Hariri, they're not Nabih Birri, they're not traditional political parties. They don't have family money to support them. And this is the main challenge. How can these MPs perform when they don't have much to rely on, when the rest of the society is literally crumbling because of the economic crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I think you raise what's ultimately sort of the key issue right now. And Heiko, if we're looking at that, obviously, given the stakes that at play in the country, and Luna has mentioned some of these here. We mentioned some in the introduction. We're in for a rocky road ahead. So if we're looking at post elections right now, we're in this phase where the current government is now in caretaker form, and we're going to enter this kind of what is traditionally a slow, sort of long, drawn-out process of government formation. What kinds of things should we be looking for, expecting in the months to come now in this caretaker situation, and particularly related to what Luna was talking about? We have the $3 billion IMF rescue package on the table, but there's questions around whether the government in caretaker status even has the authority to really sort of pursue this type of agreement. So, what are we looking at on this sort of practical economic side as we move forward in this process of forming a new government?
Well, I'm afraid I cannot offer much optimism. So, I mean, we have as Crisis Group, have done quite a few interviews just before and just after the elections, and talking to politicians, analysts, like of different stripes and colors. I have not found anybody who believes that there's a real chance to actually get to this IMF program, to be very frank with you. And it's, I mean, just to be clear, the outgoing government signed as what is called a staff level agreement with the IMF in April, right? That staff level agreement stipulates 8 preconditions that the Lebanese government has to fulfill, or that Lebanon has to fulfill, to even submit an application. The IMF board will not look at an application from Lebanon unless these 8 conditions are fulfilled. So that is homework. That is homework that has to be done before they can even apply. And then after applying, of course, there's another long loop. But if you just talk about these 8 conditions, I mean, somebody who spoke to a colleague of mine made a joke. It's like we call it, maybe in Arabic you would call that a yellow joke. It's a joke that is not really funny, which is that he said, well, it's actually very apt that it's 8 conditions, because if you look at the number 8 and you put the number 8 to sleep, as the Lebanese politicians want to do, it becomes an infinity sign, and that's why 8 is a very apt number. So, if you look at these, and why am I so pessimistic on this? If you look at these 8 preconditions, they all, or the majority, relate to the banking sector. They relate to the financial system. And that makes perfect sense, because if you don't fix the financial system, there's no point in putting a single dollar into this economy and into this country. It's like, you pour fuel into a tank that has a sieve as a bottom. It's just completely pointless to do this. We are talking about dealing with 60, maybe 70 billion of losses in the financial sector that have to be allocated or that have to be distributed. We're talking about restructuring the entire banking sector, looking at every single bank to find out which ones are actually viable. And my prediction is, I've talked about this with many economists, I mean, out of these 18, if you come out with 2 that are viable, that would be a positive surprise. It's really that bad. We're talking about looking at actually finally throwing open the books of the central bank. And if you throw open the books of the central bank, you are going to throw up, and I think everybody is aware of that, you're going to throw up dozens of closets, and skeletons will fall out by the dozen. So these are conditions that the current political leadership is extremely unlikely to meet, because they will touch on their immediate interests. They will touch on their economic basis of power, and the connections between the financial sector and the political sphere, if you want, or field, are so intricate, and it's cross-cutting. You find them on both sides of the traditional divides. They're everywhere. These people will maintain their interests. They'll defend their interests. They'll continue trying to shove the losses on everybody else, or minimize their own losses. And they will bring down any government or block any government if we get a government that actually tries to do something about it. And I mean, the outgoing government, ironically, on the very last day of its tenure, this voted on a financial recovery plan at the moment when they could really be certain that they would not have to implement it. They voted on a recovery plan that sort of goes along with these 8 conditions. They threw the hot potato into the lap of the new parliament, which now would have to vote on that. And so that's a nice challenge for the new change MPs to position themselves to these measures that are going to be unpopular. I mean, unpopular is really not the word. I mean, I don't know what adjective would be the right one. But I mean, somebody will have to touch that hot potato, or things will just not moving forward. And my bet is on the latter. Things will not be moving forward. We will not go into this. We will not get to the IMF deal. And finally, one thing we should also mention: you're talking about $3 billion. The central bank, since the beginning of the year, has wasted $2 billion, 2/3 of what the IMF may give Lebanon over 4 years, on a completely futile attempt to stabilize the currency, just to create, a simulacrum of stability for the elections. And they're going to continue doing that. I mean, the amounts of money that has been wasted so far by simply kicking the can down the road, systematically kicking the can down the road, because none of these actors want to accept any cuts to their interest, are absolutely staggering. They're much more than what Lebanon can ever get from the IMF. And the fear is, if they in the past 2 years, the economic pressure has not prompted these people to change, they won't change going forward. They will not change until the cookie box is really empty, until everything is spent and everything is consumed. And if they can get to the gold, they'll sell the gold too. Sorry, I cannot really say anything better than that.
If there is any gold left,
If there is,
no one has seen the gold.
So many unknowns and so many unknowns.
Yeah, absolutely. There's tons more we could discuss, but we're running short on time. But I just want to throw it back to Luna to kind of I guess wrap us up here. Heiko provided a pretty dire outlook, but I think many would agree it's a very realistic one in terms of what he's describing. So if we're taking that picture into account, which by all accounts does not look very pretty moving forward, in conjunction with we've seen this kind of small spark of hope that comes out of this latest election. If we're talking about sort of engaging with Lebanon's various communities, given this kind of context that we have, which Heiko outlined very articulately here, how I guess how are people going to be convinced at all that change is possible, and that there's hope, not even for the short term, let's say, but for the longer term down the road? And I hate to kind of end on a question which is difficult, but I think for you guys and for the Lebanese and people who are tied or are familiar with the country, this is this sort of heaviness which hangs over everything, is this idea of, okay, we see these sparks of hope, there's positive sort of small things here or there, but kind of the weight of the overall situation economically, and then, as Heiko was pointing to, the kind of absolute unwillingness of the traditional politicians on all sides of the spectrum to really tackle these core issues. How do we kind of maintain this idea that change could be possible?
Well, I think that there are two sides to this, two answers to this question. First answer would be that the romantic answer to it, which is that those who are stuck inside get a lot of their strength and power from those who are abroad, who are supporting them or trying to support them mentally, emotionally, and financially. But this is not enough, because you're living two different lives. Those who remain in Lebanon are living in a complete different reality. As I said it once during the post-election celebration, every Lebanese expat is celebrating. The Lebanese who are inside Lebanon might not be feeling the same joy or happiness, because they are living in a very different reality. So maybe some strength from one another, but this is the romantic answer. The logical answer that comes to mind is that we need help. I don't think we are able to do this on our own anymore. Like, the country needs help. The country needs some sort of help that is not an intervention, that is not in any way an intervention, but that is also not presidents and politicians coming in, giving statements, sitting on the table with the same leaders, with the same sectarian leaders, with the same traditional parties who are making it hard to implement changes. And it is not enough to impose sanctions on Riyad Salameh or on his brother or on his son, and these are all nice headlines, but the reality is different. We need another kind of help. For that, I don't have an answer yet, because I cannot imagine what type of help would push for changes at this moment, because the thing that I might see as help, other people might see as an intervention, as a threat to the stability of the communities. It's a very hard conversation to have. It's a very hard question to answer in one conversation. But we need help. This is certain.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I hope at some point later we can continue this conversation. But I will end it there for now. Luna and Heiko, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was a real pleasure, and a lot of deep insights into Lebanon. And I hope people who are less familiar maybe with sort of these dynamics of the country have a little bit of a better picture now, beyond kind of what's normally in the international media headlines. So really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope we can do this again sometime in the near future.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks.